The Galactic Academy's Advanced Strategic Studies classroom buzzed with the familiar hum of translation devices as species from across known space settled into their assigned learning pods. The massive amphitheater could accommodate over 300 students, each pod designed to meet the specific environmental needs of its occupant. Crystalline beings from the Zeta cluster required high-frequency light exposure, while the methane-breathing Corthans needed sealed atmospheric chambers. The diversity was staggering, representing 47 different species from the Core Worlds Alliance. Marcus Chun adjusted his simple breathing apparatus and glanced around the room with quiet interest. The human section occupied a modest corner, just 12 pods among hundreds. Earth had only recently gained provisional membership in the Alliance, and their representatives were still viewed with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism by the established galactic community. At the front of the amphitheater, Professor Vexhai, a towering Altarian with 4 arms and iridescent blue skin, manipulated a holographic display showing star charts and fleet formations. Her species had been spacefaring for over 10,000 years and had helped establish many of the Alliance's core military doctrines. Today we examine the Battle of Keftar Station, Professor Vexhai announced, her voice carrying clearly through the translation network. A textbook example of superior strategy overcoming numerical disadvantage. The hegemony forces, despite being outnumbered 3-1, achieved decisive victory through careful positioning and timing. Marcus took notes on his tablet, genuinely interested in the tactical analysis. The battle had occurred 2 centuries before humanity had even achieved interstellar flight. But the strategic principles were fascinating. The hegemony commander had used asteroid fields and gravitational anomalies to break up the attacking force, defeating them piecemeal. 3 rows down from the human section, a cluster of pods held students from the Corvan Empire. The Corvans were among the most militaristic species in the Alliance, their society built around concepts of honor, strength, and tactical superiority. Their representatives at the Academy were typically from their warrior caste, trained from childhood in the arts of war. Thekmor, a particularly large Corvan with ritual scarification covering his grayscaled arms, raised one of his 4 hands. Professor, this battle demonstrates why primitive species require extensive guidance before they can contribute meaningfully to Alliance defense strategies. The hegemony forces succeeded because they had thousands of years of military tradition to draw upon. Several students from newer Alliance members shifted uncomfortably in their pods. The comment was clearly directed at species like humanity, who had only recently developed faster-than-light travel and were still learning to navigate galactic politics. Professor Vexhai nodded approvingly. An astute observation, Thekmor. Military tradition and institutional knowledge are indeed crucial factors in strategic thinking. The hegemony's success stemmed from generations of accumulated wisdom. Marcus frowned slightly, but remained silent. He had read extensively about the Battle of Keftar Station in preparation for this class, and while the hegemony's victory was impressive, he had noticed several tactical opportunities that seemed to have been overlooked in the standard analysis. Another Corvan student, Veltra, leaned forward in her pod. It seems wasteful to include species in strategic studies before they have proven their capabilities in actual combat. Theory without experience is merely academic exercise. A few chuckles rippled through the Corvan section, and several other established species made sounds of agreement. Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting emotional would only reinforce their preconceptions about human temperament. Professor Vexhai gestured to the holographic display, zooming in on the asteroid field where the decisive engagement had taken place. The hegemony commander, Fleet Admiral Zeph Tun, demonstrated remarkable foresight in choosing this battleground. By forcing the enemy to approach through the asteroid field, he negated their numerical advantage and created multiple choke points. Marcus studied the tactical display carefully, noting the positions of the various fleet elements and the timing of their movements. The strategy was indeed clever, but he could see several ways it might have been improved or countered. Thekmor spoke again, his tone becoming more pointed. Perhaps some of our newer Alliance members would benefit from observing proven tactical methods before attempting to contribute their own theories. Wisdom comes from experience, not from reading historical texts. This time the comment was clearly aimed at the human section. Several other species turned to look at Marcus and his fellow human students, their expressions ranging from curious to dismissive. Marcus felt the urge to respond, but held himself back. He had been warned by his academy advisors that some established species might test newer members, trying to provoke reactions that would reinforce negative stereotypes. The smart play was to remain professional and focused on learning. But then, Veltra decided to push further. I notice our human colleagues are very quiet today. Perhaps they are still trying to understand concepts that other species mastered millennia ago. The classroom fell silent, and Marcus could feel the attention of hundreds of students focused on the human section. His fellow humans looked uncomfortable, clearly uncertain how to respond to the provocation. Marcus took a deep breath and activated his communication link. I have a question about the tactical analysis, Professor. Professor Vexhai turned toward him with interest. Please proceed, Student Chun. The standard interpretation focuses on Admiral Zeftun's use of the asteroid field as a force multiplier, Marcus said carefully. But, looking at the enemy fleet composition and approach vectors, wouldn't there have been an opportunity to achieve victory much more quickly and with significantly fewer casualties? A murmur ran through the classroom. Questioning established tactical doctrine was unusual, especially from a student whose species had only recently achieved spaceflight. Thekmore's scarred features twisted into what might have been a sneer. Please enlighten us with your superior wisdom, human. What did Admiral Zeftun miss that your species would have seen? Marcus hesitated for just a moment, aware that he was about to cross a line. But the dismissive tone and the assumption that humans had nothing to contribute finally pushed him past his tolerance for diplomatic silence. The enemy fleet was using a standard three-wave assault formation, Marcus said, highlighting elements of the holographic display with his tablet interface. Wave 1 consisted of heavy cruisers designed to punch through defensive positions. Wave 2 was composed of fast attack vessels meant to exploit any breaches. Wave 3 held the support ships and command vessels. Professor Vexhai nodded. Correct. A time-tested formation that has been used successfully for over 3,000 years. But Admiral Zeftun engaged Wave 1 in the asteroid field, exactly as the enemy expected, Marcus continued. He won because his forces were better positioned and more maneuverable, but the battle lasted 4 hours and resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Your point being? Veltra interjected, her tone skeptical. Marcus manipulated the display, showing alternative fleet positions and movement vectors. Instead of engaging Wave 1 directly, Admiral Zeftun could have used the asteroid field as cover to bypass them entirely. Wave 3 was the real target. Eliminate the command ships and support vessels, and Waves 1 and 2 become isolated and vulnerable. Thekmore laughed, a harsh sound that translated poorly through the audio system. You suggest ignoring the primary threat to attack the weakest ships? This is exactly why inexperienced species require supervision. Wave 3 only appeared weak because of the formation, Marcus replied calmly. But they were carrying the enemy's strategic command center, their logistical support, and their communications hub. Destroying those first would have turned Waves 1 and 2 from coordinated fleets into isolated hunting packs. Several students leaned forward in their pods, suddenly more interested in the discussion. Marcus highlighted specific ships in the enemy formation, showing their roles and capabilities. Look at the timing, Marcus said. Wave 1 entered the asteroid field at 1430 standard. Wave 3 wouldn't clear the field until 1645. That's a 2-hour and 15-minute window where the command ships were essentially trapped in the formation. Professor Vexhai studied the display with growing interest. Continue your analysis, Student Chun. Admiral Zeftun had 67 ships, Marcus said, his confidence growing. The standard tactical doctrine was to use all available forces to engage Wave 1 directly. But if he had split his force, say, 40 ships to harass and delay Wave 1 while 27 conducted a fast strike against Wave 3, the entire enemy fleet would have been neutralized within 90 minutes instead of 4 hours. The classroom had gone completely silent. Marcus could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, But he pressed on, warming to his subject. The asteroid field provided perfect cover for this kind of operation, he continued. Admiral Zephton could have sent his fastest ships on a wide loop around the field, approaching Wave 3 from the opposite side, while Wave 1 was still engaged with the defensive force. Without their command structure and support vessels, Waves 1 and 2 would have been forced to retreat or surrender. Thekmore's expression had shifted from dismissive amusement to something approaching anger. You criticize a battle won by one of the Alliance's greatest tactical minds based on theoretical speculation. This is precisely the kind of reckless thinking that leads to disaster in actual combat. I'm not criticizing Admiral Zephton, Marcus replied. His victory was brilliant given the tactical doctrine of his time. But tactical thinking evolves. What worked 3,000 years ago might not be the optimal approach today. Veltra activated her communication link, her voice sharp with irritation. Human arrogance is already becoming apparent. You assume your primitive understanding is superior to millennia of proven military science. Marcus felt his temper beginning to rise but forced himself to maintain a calm tone. I'm not claiming superiority. I'm suggesting that different perspectives might offer new insights. Human military history may be shorter than yours, but we've had to develop tactics for fighting against superior forces. Sometimes necessity drives innovation. Human military history, Thekmore said with obvious contempt, consists primarily of primitive conflicts using chemical explosives and kinetic weapons. You lack any understanding of true interstellar warfare. Actually, Marcus said quietly, that's not entirely accurate. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable now, and Professor Vexhai made a subtle gesture to her teaching assistants, clearly aware that the classroom dynamic was shifting into dangerous territory. Human warfare may have been limited to a single planet, Marcus continued, but the scale and intensity of our conflicts required constant tactical innovation. We fought wars involving millions of soldiers across multiple continents simultaneously. We've developed strategies for air, land, sea, space, and cyber warfare. We've learned to coordinate complex operations across vast distances with limited communication. He paused, meeting Thekmore's gaze directly. And we've learned to win against superior forces by thinking differently, not by following established doctrine. The Corvin student's scarred features darkened. Impressive words from a species that has never faced real military pressure. Your planet-bound conflicts are nothing compared to the challenges of galactic warfare. You're probably right, Marcus admitted. Our experience is limited, but sometimes a fresh perspective can see things that experience might miss. Admiral Zephton won his battle, but 40% of his fleet was damaged or destroyed. My approach would have achieved the same victory with less than 5% casualties. Veltra made a sound that might have been derision. Based on what evidence? You have no experience with actual space combat, no understanding of the complexities involved in coordinating fleets across interstellar distances. Based on mathematical analysis and strategic principles that apply regardless of the scale, Marcus replied. And based on something my species learned the hard way, that conventional thinking often fails when facing unconventional problems. Thekmore leaned forward in his pod, his forearms spread in what Marcus recognized as an aggressive posture. Then, perhaps you would be willing to demonstrate this superior human tactical thinking in a more concrete manner. Professor Vexhai finally intervened. Students, I think this discussion has become quite enough. No, Thekmore interrupted, his attention fixed on Marcus. I believe Student Chen should have the opportunity to prove his theories. I formally challenge him to a tactical simulation. A collective intake of breath rippled through the classroom. Tactical challenges between students were rare, but not unheard of at the academy. They typically occurred between species with established military rivalries or when academic disputes reached the point where only practical demonstration could resolve them. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. A tactical simulation against a Corvin warrior caste student would be no small matter. The Corvins trained for this kind of exercise from childhood, and their academy representatives were among the most skilled in their age groups. But he had opened this door with his criticism of established doctrine, and backing down now would only reinforce the perception that humans were all talk and no substance. I accept, Marcus said quietly. Professor Vexhai looked concerned. Student Chun, tactical simulations are extremely complex exercises. Perhaps it would be better to continue this discussion in a more academic setting. With respect, Professor Thekmore said, Student Chun has made significant claims about the superiority of human tactical thinking. Academic discussion has proven insufficient to resolve the matter. Marcus stood up in his pod, feeling the weight of the moment. I'm willing to participate in the simulation, Professor. If my analysis is correct, it should be demonstrable. If it's wrong, then I need to learn that too. The professor looked between Marcus and Thekmore, clearly calculating the potential diplomatic implications. Tensions between established alliance species and newer members were always sensitive, but suppressing a formal challenge might create even more problems. Very well, Professor Vexhai said finally. We will conduct a tactical simulation using the Battle of Keftar Station scenario. Student Chun will command the hegemony forces. Student Thekmore will command the attacking fleet. Both forces will be balanced according to historical records. Marcus felt a chill of realization. In accepting the challenge, he had inadvertently agreed to defend the same position Admiral Zeftun had held centuries ago. But Thekmore would know the historical outcome and would undoubtedly try to exploit any weaknesses in Marcus's unconventional strategy. The simulation will begin in 1 hour, Professor Vexhai announced. Both students should use the time to prepare their strategies and review the available intelligence data. As the other students began filing out of the classroom, Marcus remained in his pod, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just committed to. He had criticized a legendary military victory and proposed an alternative strategy based purely on theoretical analysis. Now he would have to prove his ideas worked under pressure, against an opponent trained from birth for this kind of warfare. The tactical simulation chamber was a marvel of Alliance technology, capable of creating incredibly detailed virtual environments that responded to strategic decisions in real time. Students who failed badly in simulations were often transferred out of the strategic studies program entirely. Marcus looked up to find several of his fellow human students approaching his pod. Sarah Kim, a brilliant engineering student from Mars Colony, looked worried. Marcus, are you sure about this? She asked quietly. Thekmore isn't just any Corvin student. He's from a military family that's produced fleet commanders for over 1,000 years. His academy scores in tactical simulations are among the highest on record. I know, Marcus replied, trying to project more confidence than he felt. But somebody has to show that humans belong here. If we just accept being dismissed and marginalized, we'll never be taken seriously as Alliance members. David Park, another human student studying xenosociology, shook his head. But if you lose badly, it'll reinforce every negative stereotype about human capabilities. You're not just representing yourself in there. Marcus understood the pressure they were describing. The human delegation to the academy was small and closely watched. Their performance would influence how Earth was perceived by the broader galactic community for decades to come. I understand the stakes, Marcus said quietly. But I genuinely believe my strategic analysis is correct. If I'm right, this could change how other species view human tactical thinking. If I'm wrong, well, at least we'll know. As his fellow students dispersed to observe the simulation, Marcus was left alone with his thoughts and his growing understanding of what he had gotten himself into. He had 1 hour to prepare for what might be the most important hour of his life. The tactical simulation chamber awaited, and, with it, a test that would determine not just his own academic future, but potentially the respect accorded to his entire species in the galactic community. Marcus opened his tactical planning interface and began to work. The tactical simulation chamber hummed with activity as technicians calibrated the holographic projectors and neural interface systems. Marcus stood at the edge of the massive circular platform, watching as thousands of points of light coalesced into a detailed representation of the Keftar system. The asteroid field stretched across several million cubic kilometers, each rock precisely positioned according to historical records. Word of the challenge had spread throughout the academy, and the observation galleries were filled with students and faculty from dozens of species. Marcus could see his fellow humans clustered together in one section, their faces tight with worry. The Corvin delegation occupied prime seating, their expressions ranging from confident to openly amused. Professor Vexhai approached Marcus's command station, her forearms manipulating multiple data tablets simultaneously. Student Shun, you have access to the same intelligence data that was available to Admiral Zefton. Enemy fleet composition, estimated arrival times, and preliminary reconnaissance reports. Do you have any questions about the simulation parameters? Marcus reviewed the data streams flowing across his interface. 312 enemy ships arranged in the standard three-wave formation. Wave 1 consisted of 96 heavy cruisers with enhanced armor and assault capabilities. Wave 2 contained 144 fast attack vessels designed for breakthrough operations. Wave 3 held 72 ships including command vessels, support cruisers, and logistical units. Against this force, Marcus commanded 67 ships of various classes, positioned around Keftar Station in what historically had been considered optimal defensive formation. The station itself was a massive orbital facility housing over 2 million civilians, making its protection paramount. The victory conditions remain the same as the historical battle? Marcus asked. Correct. Prevent the enemy from capturing or destroying Keftar Station while minimizing casualties to your own forces and civilian population. Standard alliance engagement protocols apply. Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the tactical challenges ahead. In his preparation hour, he had refined his alternative strategy, but implementing it under pressure against a skilled opponent would be entirely different from theoretical planning. Across the chamber, Thekmore stood at his own command station, his scarred features impassive as he reviewed his attacking fleet's capabilities. The Corbin student had changed into traditional military attire for the simulation, a gesture that was probably intended to emphasize the seriousness with which he took this challenge. As Marcus watched, Thekmore activated his communication system and began issuing preliminary orders to his fleet commanders. Even in simulation, his movements carried the confidence of someone trained from childhood in military command protocols. Simulation participants, take your positions, Professor Vexhai announced. The exercise will begin with enemy forces at the edge of the Keftar system, approximately 6 hours from engagement range. Marcus activated his neural interface, feeling the familiar sensation of expanded awareness as his consciousness linked with the simulation network. Suddenly, he could perceive the positions and status of all 67 ships under his command, their capabilities and readiness levels flowing through his mind like a complex musical score. The enemy fleet appeared as red icons at the edge of the system, already moving toward their objective with methodical precision. Marcus could see Thekmore's strategy taking shape, a textbook approach that would bring all three waves into optimal attack formation. But Marcus had no intention of fighting a textbook battle. Fleet command to all vessels, Marcus transmitted, his voice carrying across multiple communication channels. Prepare for tactical redeployment. Group Alpha, maintain current positions around the station. Group Beta, prepare for independent operations. Group Charlie, begin stealth approach to coordinates I'm transmitting now. In the observation galleries, Marcus could see faculty members leaning forward with interest. His initial deployments were clearly different from the historical defensive pattern, but the logic wasn't immediately obvious. Thekmore's fleet continued its steady advance, Wave 1 leading with heavy cruisers arranged in a broad assault formation. The Corbin student was following established tactical doctrine, which called for overwhelming force applied to the strongest point of enemy defense. Marcus watched the enemy approach for 45 minutes of simulation time, letting Thekmore commit to his attack vector before revealing his true strategy. When Wave 1 reached the outer edge of the asteroid field, Marcus finally made his move. Group Charlie, begin flanking maneuver. Group Beta, commence harassment operations. Group Alpha, prepare to execute defensive protocols on my mark. 27 of Marcus's fastest ships suddenly broke from concealed positions among the larger asteroids, their engines burning bright as they accelerated toward the rear of the enemy formation. Simultaneously, another 15 ships moved to engage Wave 1 directly, but not in the defensive pattern Thekmore would have expected. Instead of forming a traditional battle line, Marcus's forces split into small hunter-killer groups, using the asteroid field's natural cover to conduct hit and run attacks against the larger enemy formation. In the observation galleries, murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd. This was clearly not standard Alliance tactical doctrine. Thekmor responded quickly, redirecting some of his fast attack vessels from Wave 2 to counter Marcus's flanking force. But this required breaking up his carefully coordinated formation, exactly the kind of disruption Marcus had been hoping to achieve. Wave 3 is the target, Marcus transmitted to his flanking group. Ignore everything else. Cut through their formation and eliminate command and support vessels. The next 30 minutes of simulation time unfolded with breathtaking speed and complexity. Marcus's harassment force in the asteroid field kept Wave 1's heavy cruisers occupied, preventing them from bringing their full firepower to bear on any single target. His flanking force raced through space toward Wave 3, accepting casualties from Thekmor's intercept attempts but maintaining their overall mission focus. The key moment came when Marcus's 27 flanking ships reached Wave 3's position. Instead of engaging in traditional ship-to-ship combat, they had formed into a concentrated spear formation designed to punch through the enemy line and strike specific high-value targets. Designating priority targets, Marcus transmitted. Command Ship Veltharuk, Support Cruiser Mordain, Communication Hub Thekfor. All units focus fire. What followed was perhaps the most intense 15 minutes of simulated combat Marcus had ever experienced. His flanking force was heavily outnumbered, but they had achieved complete tactical surprise. Thekmor's command vessels, positioned for coordination rather than direct combat, were suddenly fighting for their lives against an enemy that had appeared seemingly from nowhere. The first command ship died 12 minutes into the engagement, its destruction sending shock waves through the enemy fleet's coordination network. The second fell 4 minutes later, taking with it the primary communication systems that allowed Waves 1 and 2 to coordinate their attacks. Thekmor fought brilliantly, repositioning his remaining forces to counter Marcus's unorthodox tactics. But by the time he had adapted to the new situation, the damage was done. Wave 3 was effectively neutralized, and Waves 1 and 2 were operating as independent units without centralized command. Group Alpha, begin final phase operations, Marcus transmitted. Enemy coordination is broken. Engage Waves 1 and 2 separately. The remaining 25 ships around Keftar Station suddenly emerged from their defensive positions, moving to exploit the chaos Marcus's flanking attack had created. Instead of waiting for the enemy to reach them, they advanced aggressively, catching Wave 1 while it was still trying to adapt to the loss of fleet command. The battle ended 73 minutes after initial engagement, with Thekmor's surviving forces in full retreat. Marcus had achieved decisive victory while losing only 11 ships, a casualty rate of less than 17% compared to the historical battle's 42%. As the simulation shut down and the holographic display faded, the chamber fell into stunned silence. Marcus stepped away from his command interface, his mind still buzzing with the intensity of the tactical experience. Professor Vexhai approached his station, her expression unreadable. Student Shun, please explain your strategic reasoning for the benefit of the observers. Marcus took a deep breath, aware that hundreds of eyes were fixed upon him. The key was recognizing that Wave 3 wasn't actually the weakest part of the enemy formation. It was the most critical. Traditional doctrine focuses on stopping the primary assault force, but that often means accepting a grinding battle of attrition. He gestured toward the fading tactical display. By eliminating command and control first, I turned the enemy's numerical advantage into a disadvantage. 3 coordinated waves became 3 separate forces, each of which could be defeated individually. Thekmor had remained at his command station, his scarred features showing a mixture of anger and grudging respect. Your tactics were unconventional, but they required significant risk. If your flanking force had been intercepted or destroyed, you would have lost both the tactical initiative and a substantial portion of your fleet. True, Marcus acknowledged. But the same criticism applies to traditional defensive strategies. Admiral Zeftun's historical victory was brilliant, but it required accepting heavy casualties to achieve success. Sometimes taking calculated risks early in an engagement can prevent much larger losses later. A voice from the observation gallery spoke up. Student Chun, your tactics departed significantly from established alliance doctrine. How would you coordinate such operations in actual combat conditions? Marcus looked up to see Professor Kethvar, the Academy's senior instructor in strategic studies. The ancient hegemony military leader's presence meant this simulation had drawn attention from the highest levels of the faculty. The coordination challenge is real, Marcus admitted. But human military history includes examples of similar operations conducted across vast distances with primitive communication systems. The key is giving subordinate commanders clear objectives and the authority to achieve them through improvisation. Improvisation, Veltra said from her position in the Corvin section, her tone skeptical. A polite term for abandoning proven tactical principles. Marcus turned toward her, his confidence growing. Respectfully, I would argue that improvisation and adaptation are tactical principles. The ability to change strategy based on battlefield conditions has been central to successful military operations throughout history. Professor Kethvar descended from the gallery to the simulation floor, his ancient form moving with surprising grace. As one of the few survivors of the original Battle of Keftar Station, his opinion carried enormous weight. Student Chun, the elderly hegemony officer said slowly, you have demonstrated that alternative tactical approaches can achieve the same strategic objectives with reduced casualties. This is noteworthy. The understatement sent ripples of discussion through the observation galleries. Coming from Professor Kethvar, such qualified praise was equivalent to high honors. However, the professor continued, tactical innovation without strategic understanding can be dangerous. Your approach succeeded in simulation, but would it scale to larger conflicts? Could such tactics be employed by commanders with less intuitive grasp of their implementation? It was a fair question, and Marcus considered his answer carefully. I think the principles would scale, Professor, though the specific tactics would need adaptation. The core insight is that destroying an enemy's ability to coordinate is often more valuable than destroying their ability to fight. Thekmore finally spoke from his command station, his voice carrying a note Marcus couldn't quite identify. Your tactics were effective, human. I underestimated your strategic capabilities. Coming from a Corvin warrior caste student, the admission was remarkable. Thekmore was essentially acknowledging that he had been wrong about human military potential. But Veltra wasn't ready to concede the point. One successful simulation hardly proves the superiority of human tactics. Student Thekmore was constrained by his role as the attacking force and couldn't adapt his strategy as freely as Student Chun. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That's a fair criticism. The simulation parameters did give me certain advantages. But I think the broader point remains valid. Tactical thinking benefits from diverse perspectives. Professor Vexheim moved to the center of the chamber, clearly preparing to conclude the exercise. This has been an illuminating demonstration of alternative strategic thinking. Both students performed admirably under pressure. But before she could continue, Veltra activated her communication system once more. Professor, I believe a single tactical exercise is insufficient to resolve the questions raised today. Perhaps Student Chun would accept a second challenge, one where he faces an opponent not constrained by historical parameters. Marcus felt a chill of realization. Veltra was essentially challenging him to a second simulation, one where she would have complete freedom to design and implement whatever strategy she chose. There would be no historical precedents to analyze, no established patterns to exploit. The chamber fell silent as everyone waited for Marcus's response. He had proven his theoretical analysis could work in practice, but now he faced a different kind of test entirely. Professor Kethvar raised one aged hand. Student Veltrau raises an interesting proposition. Student Chun, you have already demonstrated considerable tactical skill. Do you feel prepared for a more open-ended challenge? Marcus looked around the chamber, seeing the mixture of expectation, doubt, and curiosity on hundreds of faces. His fellow humans looked worried, clearly concerned that he might be pushing his luck too far. But he also recognized an opportunity. If he could succeed in a second simulation against an unconstrained opponent, it would establish human tactical capabilities beyond any reasonable doubt. I accept Student Veltra's challenge, Marcus said quietly. The Corvin student's expression showed satisfaction, and perhaps a hint of predatory anticipation. Excellent. Professor Vexhai, might I suggest we use the Tauvin Nebula scenario? It provides multiple tactical options without historical precedent to constrain either participant. Professor Vexhai looked uncertain. 2 tactical simulations in a single day is highly unusual. Perhaps we should schedule the second exercise for later in the week. With respect, Professor, Veltra replied, tactical momentum is a crucial factor in military operations. Student Chin's confidence is at its peak now. Delaying would give him additional preparation time that wouldn't be available in actual combat conditions. It was a clever manipulation, Marcus realized. Veltra was using his own success against him, making it difficult to request additional preparation time without appearing to seek unfair advantage. I'm prepared to proceed immediately, Marcus said, meeting Veltra's gaze directly. The second challenge had been issued and accepted. In 30 minutes, Marcus would face an opponent determined to prove that his first victory had been merely luck. The stakes had just gotten considerably higher. The Tauvin Nebula scenario materialized around Marcus as the simulation chamber recalibrated for the second tactical exercise. Unlike the historically grounded Battle of Keftar Station, this environment was designed to test pure strategic thinking without the benefit of established precedents or known optimal solutions. The nebula itself stretched across 47 light-years, its swirling clouds of ionized gas creating a maze of sensor shadows, electromagnetic interference, and gravitational anomalies. Hidden within its depths were 17 strategic objectives, mining stations, research facilities, and communication relays that both sides would compete to control or destroy. Marcus studied the tactical briefing as it scrolled across his interface. This time he commanded 85 ships of mixed classes, while Veltra controlled a force of 91 vessels with slightly different capabilities. The asymmetrical force composition meant neither side could rely on simple numerical superiority to achieve victory. The victory conditions were elegantly complex. Control of 10 or more strategic objectives for a continuous period of 2 hours would constitute victory, but objectives could change hands multiple times during the engagement. Alternatively, complete destruction of the enemy fleet would end the simulation immediately. From her command station across the chamber, Veltra radiated confidence as she reviewed her force composition and began issuing preliminary orders. Unlike Thekmore's traditional approach, she was clearly planning something more sophisticated and unpredictable. In the observation galleries, the crowd had grown significantly. Word of Marcus's first victory had spread throughout the academy, and faculty members from multiple departments had arrived to witness this unprecedented second challenge. The human delegation looked tense but supportive, while the Corvin section watched with expressions ranging from anticipation to barely concealed hostility. Professor Kethvar had taken a position near the center of the observation area, his ancient eyes focused intently on the developing scenario. Several other senior faculty members flanked him, including representatives from species Marcus didn't recognize. Simulation participants, you have 15 minutes for initial strategic planning, Professor Vexhai announced. Enemy contact is expected within 3 hours of simulation time, but the nebula's sensor interference means exact positions and movements will remain uncertain until close-range engagement. Marcus activated his tactical planning interface and began analyzing the strategic landscape. The 17 objectives were distributed throughout the nebula in a pattern that seemed random, but probably wasn't. Each objective had different defensive capabilities and strategic value, from lightly defended mining stations to heavily fortified command centers. The key insight came to Marcus as he studied the nebula's electromagnetic properties. The ionized gas clouds that created sensor interference would also disrupt long-range communications between ships. This meant traditional fleet coordination would be extremely difficult, forcing commanders to rely on smaller autonomous units operating with minimal central control. Veltra's strategy became apparent within the first hour of simulation time. Instead of concentrating her forces for decisive battles, she had divided her fleet into 15 small task forces, each targeting different objectives simultaneously. It was an elegant approach that would force Marcus to spread his own forces thin if he tried to defend everything. But Marcus had no intention of playing a purely defensive strategy. All ships, implement formation Gamma, he transmitted, watching as his 85 vessels organized into 7 autonomous battle groups. Unlike Veltra's numerous small task forces, Marcus's groups were larger and more heavily armed, designed for concentrated strikes rather than distributed occupation. The first engagements began 90 minutes into the simulation as Veltra's leading elements reached the outermost objectives. Marcus watched from his command station as 3 of his strategic targets fell under enemy control within minutes of each other. In the observation gallery, he could hear murmurs of concern from the human section. It appeared that Veltra's distributed strategy was succeeding brilliantly, while Marcus's concentrated forces were too slow to respond to multiple simultaneous threats. But Marcus remained calm, executing the second phase of his strategy. Instead of racing to recapture lost objectives, his battle groups drove deeper into the nebula toward targets Veltra hadn't yet reached. Rather than defending what he had, he was seizing what she wanted. Battle Group Alpha, secure Objective 7. Battle Group Beta, take Objective 12. All units, prepare for accelerated timeline. The tactical display showed a complex dance of forces as both commanders maneuvered for advantage. Veltra had captured 5 objectives to Marcus's 3, but her forces were now scattered across a vast area, while Marcus's remained concentrated and mutually supporting. The critical moment came when Veltra attempted to consolidate her gains by moving additional forces to defend her captured objectives. This required pulling units away from their ongoing attacks, creating a brief window of opportunity. Marcus struck with devastating precision. Battle Group Delta, his most powerful formation, suddenly appeared at Objective 4, where Veltra had stationed only a light defensive force. Within 12 minutes of simulation time, Marcus had not only captured the objective, but completely destroyed the Corvin force defending it. All battle groups, execute Protocol 7, Marcus transmitted. Target enemy concentrations, not territory. What followed was a masterclass in concentration of force. Instead of trying to defend his own objectives or capture new ones, Marcus began systematically hunting down and destroying Veltra's scattered task forces. Each engagement was carefully chosen to ensure he had overwhelming local superiority, despite being outnumbered overall. Veltra adapted quickly, attempting to concentrate her own forces to counter Marcus's strategy. But the nebula's communication interference made coordination difficult, and Marcus had positioned his battle groups to exploit exactly this weakness. The turning point came during the engagement at Objective 9. Veltra had assembled 37 ships to defend what she clearly considered a critical position, but Marcus had anticipated this concentration. He committed 61 ships to the attack, nearly 3/4 of his remaining force, in a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously. The battle was vicious and costly for both sides. Marcus lost 18 ships in the engagement, but Veltra's defending force was completely annihilated. More importantly, the destruction of such a large enemy concentration left Marcus with decisive numerical superiority for the remainder of the simulation. Battle Group Alpha, begin objective sweep operations, Marcus transmitted. Beta and Gamma, continue hunter-killer protocols. We end this quickly. The final phase of the simulation lasted only 43 minutes. With Veltra's forces reduced to small, isolated groups, Marcus methodically recaptured lost objectives while simultaneously hunting down remaining enemy ships. The Corvin student fought skillfully to the end, but mathematics eventually overcame tactics. The simulation ended with Marcus controlling 13 objectives and having destroyed over 70% of Veltra's fleet, while losing 38% of his own forces. As the holographic nebula faded and the chamber lighting returned to normal, the observation galleries erupted in discussion. Faculty members were talking animatedly among themselves while students from various species argued about the tactical innovations they had witnessed. Veltra approached Marcus's command station, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. "Your strategy was unexpected," she said carefully. "I had anticipated you would attempt to defend your initial objectives. Traditional defense would have played to your strengths," Marcus replied. "Your distributed attack strategy was brilliant. It would have overwhelmed any conventional defensive approach. I had to find a different kind of solution." Professor Kethvar descended from the observation gallery once again, his ancient features showing what might have been approval. Student Chun, explain your strategic reasoning. Why did you choose to abandon territorial control in favor of forced destruction? Marcus organized his thoughts before responding. The victory conditions created an interesting tactical problem, Professor. Controlling objectives was important, but the simulation could be won by destroying the enemy fleet entirely. I realized that protecting territory would scatter my forces and negate my advantage in concentrated firepower. But you risked losing the simulation entirely, Veltra pointed out. If I had captured 10 objectives before you could destroy my fleet, your strategy would have failed. True, Marcus acknowledged. But I calculated that your distributed strategy would make it difficult to rapidly consolidate control of 10 objectives. You had to capture them first, then defend them, then hold them for 2 continuous hours. That gave me a window to eliminate your fleet before the territorial victory condition could be met. Professor Vexhai approached the discussion area, her 4 arms carrying multiple data tablets showing detailed analysis of the simulation. Student Chin's tactical innovations included several elements not typically seen in academy exercises. The use of concentrated strikes against distributed forces, the prioritization of enemy destruction over territorial control, and the exploitation of communication limitations imposed by environmental factors. Thekmore, who had remained silent during the second simulation, finally spoke from his position in the observation area. I begin to understand why human military doctrine might offer valuable perspectives. Your approach to warfare appears fundamentally different from established alliance methodology. Different, but not necessarily superior, Marcus replied diplomatically. Every tactical approach has strengths and weaknesses. The key is understanding when and how to apply them appropriately. But several other students weren't prepared to concede the point so easily. A hegemony student named Keftar activated his communication link. Student Chun, your victories in these simulations were impressive, but they were conducted under artificial conditions. How would such tactics perform in actual combat where lives are at stake and mistakes cannot be reset? It was a sobering question, and Marcus considered it carefully before responding. You're absolutely right to question that. Simulation success doesn't automatically translate to combat effectiveness. But I would argue that the principles behind these tactics, adaptability, concentration of force, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses, are valid regardless of the specific implementation. Professor Kethvar raised one aged hand. Student Chun, you have demonstrated tactical innovation that challenges conventional alliance military doctrine. This is remarkable for someone from a species so recently introduced to galactic warfare. What, in your opinion, accounts for human tactical adaptability? Marcus felt the weight of the question. He was being asked to speak not just for himself, but potentially for his entire species' approach to military strategy. I think it comes from necessity, Professor. Human history has been shaped by constant conflict between groups with different capabilities and resources. We've had to learn to win against superior forces, which requires thinking differently about problems. Elaborate, the professor requested. Marcus took a deep breath. Earth's military history includes thousands of examples of smaller, weaker forces defeating larger, stronger enemies. We've learned that technological or numerical superiority can often be overcome through superior strategy, better intelligence, or simple willingness to fight unconventionally. A Altarian student spoke up. But surely other species have faced similar challenges. Why would humans develop uniquely adaptive tactics? Marcus paused, aware that his answer might reveal something important about human nature to the galactic community. I think it's because we've never had the luxury of overwhelming superiority for extended periods. Every major human civilization has eventually faced threats that forced them to innovate or perish. We've learned to treat tactical doctrine as a starting point, not an endpoint. Veltron nodded slowly. That would explain your apparent comfort with abandoning established tactical principles when they prove inadequate. Exactly, Marcus replied. Human military training emphasizes principles over procedures. We learn why tactics work, not just how to execute them. That makes it easier to modify or abandon them when facing novel situations. Professor Vexheim manipulated one of her data tablets, displaying tactical flowcharts that compared Marcus's simulation performance with historical academy records. Student Chin's approaches in both exercises demonstrated significantly higher efficiency ratios than typical academy performance. Force preservation was substantially better than average, while mission accomplishment remained optimal. The implications of that statement rippled through the observation galleries. Marcus had not only won both tactical challenges, he had done so while achieving better results than most academy students typically managed in similar exercises. Thekmore descended from the observation area to the simulation floor, his expression serious but no longer hostile. Student Chen, I formally withdraw my earlier statements questioning human tactical capabilities. Your performance today has demonstrated that Earth's military traditions offer valuable insights for galactic warfare. Coming from a Corvin warrior caste student, the admission was extraordinary. Thekmore was essentially acknowledging that he had been wrong about human military potential and was willing to say so publicly. But the most significant response came from Professor Kethvar himself. The ancient hegemony officer approached Marcus directly, his movements careful and deliberate. Student Chen, he said slowly, I would like to discuss the possibility of incorporating some of your tactical innovations into the Academy's advanced strategy curriculum. Would you be willing to collaborate on developing case studies based on today's simulations? Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. Being invited to contribute to the Academy's curriculum was an honor typically reserved for graduate students or senior faculty. For a first-year student from a newly admitted species, it was almost unprecedented. I would be honored to contribute, Professor, Marcus replied. As faculty and students began filtering out of the simulation chamber, Marcus remained at his command station, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had entered the classroom that morning as just another student from Earth, viewed with skepticism and barely concealed condescension by many of his peers. He was leaving as someone who had fundamentally challenged the galactic community's assumptions about human capabilities and tactical potential. The conversation would continue far beyond this single day, but something important had changed in how humans were perceived within the Academy's halls. Sarah Kim approached his station, her face glowing with pride and excitement. Marcus, do you realize what just happened? You didn't just win a couple of simulations. You proved that humans deserve to be here. Marcus looked around the chamber one final time, seeing the lingering groups of students and faculty still discussing the tactical innovations they had witnessed. The challenge issued by Thekmore had been intended to put humans in their place. Instead, it had demonstrated that Earth's military traditions had valuable contributions to make to galactic strategic thinking. But, as Marcus gathered his materials and prepared to leave the simulation chamber, he realized that this was just the beginning. Today had opened doors, but walking through them successfully would require continued excellence and innovation. The real test was yet to come. 3 weeks after the tactical simulations, Marcus discovered that his victories had created consequences far beyond the Academy's classrooms. As he walked through the corridor toward his Advanced Fleet Operations seminar, he noticed the subtle changes that had become increasingly apparent since his encounters with Thekmore and Veltra. Students from various species now acknowledged him with respectful nods rather than curious stares. Faculty members who had previously overlooked him in discussions now actively sought his opinions during strategic analysis sessions. Most significantly, his fellow human students had begun looking to him for leadership in ways that made Marcus distinctly uncomfortable. The seminar room was already half full when Marcus arrived, with the usual clusters of species-specific groups scattered throughout the amphitheater-style seating. But, unlike previous sessions, several non-human students had saved seats near the human section, apparently hoping to engage with the tactical thinking that had surprised so many observers. Professor Kethvar entered the room precisely on time, his ancient form moving with the careful dignity that came from centuries of military service. The elderly hegemony officer had become something of a mentor to Marcus since the simulations, offering insights into galactic military history that weren't available in standard textbooks. Today we examine the Zethkari Rebellion, Professor Kethvar announced, activating the holographic display that dominated the front of the classroom. A conflict that lasted 18 years and ultimately reshaped the political structure of the Outer Rim territories. Marcus settled into his seat and activated his note-taking interface, genuinely interested in learning about this historical conflict. The Zethkari Rebellion had occurred during humanity's medieval period, making it completely unfamiliar territory for him. The holographic display showed a star map covering roughly 400 light-years of space, with rebel-controlled systems highlighted in red and Alliance forces shown in blue. The conflict had clearly been massive in scope, involving thousands of ships and dozens of major engagements. The rebellion began when the Zethkari Congress declared independence from Alliance authority. Professor Kethvar continued. Their grievances were primarily economic. They objected to taxation policies and trade regulations imposed by the central government. Thekmore raised one of his four hands. Professor, the rebels were clearly outmatched from the beginning. Alliance forces outnumbered them 5-1, and they lacked the industrial capacity for sustained warfare. Why did the conflict last 18 years? Professor Kethvar manipulated the display, showing the progression of the war year by year. An excellent question, Student Thekmore. The answer reveals important lessons about the relationship between military strategy and political objectives. Marcus studied the tactical progression with growing interest. The rebels had indeed been massively outgunned, but they had managed to sustain resistance for nearly 2 decades. There had to be strategic principles at work beyond simple military force. The Alliance approached this as a traditional military problem, Professor Kethvar explained. They assembled overwhelming force and attempted to crush rebel resistance through decisive battles. But the Zethkari refused to cooperate with this strategy. Veltra leaned forward in her seat. How do you mean, Professor? The rebels avoided major engagements almost entirely. Instead, they focused on disrupting Alliance supply lines, attacking isolated outposts, and making the cost of occupation prohibitively expensive. They turned the conflict into a war of attrition rather than conquest. Marcus felt a spark of recognition. The tactical situation resembled several conflicts from human history, where technologically inferior forces had used guerrilla tactics to exhaust superior enemies. The American Revolution, the Vietnam War, numerous colonial rebellions. Earth's military history was full of examples where conventional military superiority had proven insufficient against determined irregular forces. The Alliance eventually achieved military victory, Professor Kethvar continued. But the cost was so enormous that significant political reforms were implemented to prevent future rebellions. In strategic terms, the rebels achieved most of their original objectives despite losing the war. A student from the Crystalline Zetha cluster activated their communication interface. Professor, wouldn't more aggressive Alliance tactics have ended the rebellion more quickly? Professor Kethvar's ancient features showed something that might have been a slight smile. Define more aggressive, Student Zeftal. Complete destruction of rebel infrastructure. Systematic occupation of all rebel territories. Elimination of rebel leadership through targeted assassination campaigns. Such tactics were proposed and rejected by Alliance leadership. Can anyone suggest why? Marcus found himself raising his hand before fully thinking through the implications. Because those tactics would have made the Alliance into exactly the kind of oppressive government the rebels claimed they were fighting? Professor Kethvar turned toward him with obvious approval. Elaborate, Student Chun. Marcus organized his thoughts, aware that he was venturing into politically sensitive territory. Military victory means nothing if it destroys the political legitimacy of your cause. The Alliance couldn't use tactics that would turn neutral systems against them, even if those tactics might have been militarily effective. Thekmore looked puzzled. But military victory should have established Alliance authority regardless of political considerations. Not necessarily, Marcus replied, his confidence growing. The Zethkari Rebellion wasn't really about military control, it was about the right to govern. If the Alliance had won through brutally oppressive tactics, they would have validated rebel claims about Alliance tyranny. Professor Kethvar nodded approvingly. Student Chin identifies a crucial point. Military strategy cannot be divorced from political objectives. Victory achieved through means that undermine your political goals is often more dangerous than defeat. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of intellectual pieces falling into place. That's why the rebellion lasted 18 years. The alliance was fighting with one hand tied behind their back, not because they lacked military capability, but because unlimited military force would have been politically self-defeating. Veltra activated her communication link. But surely there must have been some middle ground between complete restraint and complete brutality. Marcus considered the question. Human military history suggests that these kinds of conflicts are almost impossible to resolve through purely military means. The underlying political issues have to be addressed, or victory becomes temporary at best. A murmur ran through the classroom. Marcus had inadvertently implied that human experience might offer insights into a type of warfare that had challenged the Alliance for nearly 2 decades. Professor Kethvar manipulated the holographic display, showing specific battle locations and campaign timelines. Student Chin's observation about political constraints is astute. Alliance commanders were required to minimize civilian casualties, preserve infrastructure, and maintain the appearance of legitimate authority. These limitations significantly restricted their tactical options. But those are reasonable constraints, said a student from the gaseous Nether Collective. Civilized warfare requires protection of noncombatants. Absolutely, Marcus agreed. But that means military doctrine has to account for political reality. You can't develop tactics that assume unlimited freedom of action if your actual operations will be constrained by legitimate political concerns. Thekmore leaned back in his seat, his scarred features thoughtful. You suggest that military strategy should be subordinated to political objectives? Not subordinated, Marcus clarified. Integrated. Political goals should inform military planning from the beginning, not be imposed as afterthoughts that complicate military operations. Professor Kethvar activated a new display showing theoretical alternative strategies for the Zethkari conflict. This integration challenge has been a recurring problem in Alliance military planning. Traditional doctrine assumes that political objectives can be achieved through military victory, but asymmetric conflicts often require more nuanced approaches. Marcus studied the alternative strategies with growing excitement. Several of them resembled approaches that human military leaders had developed for similar conflicts throughout Earth's history. Professor, Marcus said carefully, has the Alliance considered counterinsurgency doctrine that focuses on population security rather than enemy destruction? Explain your thinking, Student Chun. Marcus took a deep breath, aware that he was about to suggest tactics that might seem radically different from Alliance tradition. Instead of hunting rebel forces directly, you protect civilian populations and infrastructure. Make it impossible for rebels to operate without revealing themselves. Then, use precise, minimal force to eliminate specific threats. That sounds passive and reactive, Veltra objected. How would such an approach achieve decisive results? Marcus activated his tablet interface and began sketching tactical diagrams. The key insight is that irregular forces depend entirely on population support. Cut off that support through protection rather than intimidation, and rebel operations become unsustainable. He projected his diagrams to the main classroom display. Look at the Zethkari operational pattern. They avoided major battles, but needed supplies, intelligence, and recruitment from civilian populations. Traditional alliance tactics tried to find and destroy rebel forces directly, but that's playing to their strengths. Continue, Professor Kethvar encouraged. Instead, focus on making civilian populations secure and prosperous under alliance authority. Establish local security forces, improve economic conditions, provide better governance than the rebels can offer. Make rebellion unattractive compared to cooperation. Marcus warmed to his subject, his tactical mind engaging with the strategic puzzle. Rebels can hide from military forces, but they can't hide from their own communities if those communities have more to gain from supporting legitimate authority than from supporting rebellion. Thekmore looked skeptical. This approach seems to reward rebellion by improving conditions for populations that supported rebel forces. Actually, it punishes rebellion by making it ineffective, Marcus replied. The goal isn't retribution. It's ending the conflict with the political situation more stable than when it started. Professor Kethvar manipulated the historical display, showing actual campaign results from the Zethkari conflict. Student Chin's proposed approach bears striking resemblance to tactics that proved successful in the final phases of the rebellion. Alliance forces eventually shifted to population-centric operations, which dramatically accelerated the conflict's resolution. The observation sent murmurs of discussion through the classroom. Marcus had essentially reverse-engineered successful alliance tactics based purely on theoretical analysis of the strategic situation. But human experience with such conflicts is limited, a hegemony student pointed out. How can theoretical understanding substitute for practical military experience? Marcus considered the question carefully. I think the principles scale across different contexts. Human conflicts may have been smaller and more primitive, but the fundamental dynamics between irregular forces and established authority remain consistent. Prove it, Veltra said suddenly. The classroom fell silent. Marcus turned toward the Corvin student, uncertain what she meant. Prove that these principles scale, Veltra continued. We have detailed records of the entire Zethkari rebellion. If human counterinsurgency doctrine is as effective as you suggest, demonstrate it through tactical simulation. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. Veltra was essentially challenging him to a third tactical exercise, this time using one of the most complex and politically sensitive conflicts in Alliance history. Professor Kethvar looked between Marcus and Veltra with obvious interest. Student Veltra raises an intriguing proposition. The Zethkari scenario would indeed test the practical application of theoretical counterinsurgency doctrine. I accept the challenge, Marcus said quietly. But, even as he spoke, Marcus realized that this simulation would be fundamentally different from his previous victories. The battles of Keftar Station and the Tauvin Nebula had been pure military exercises with clear victory conditions and defined endpoints. The Zethkari rebellion had been an 18-year conflict involving complex political, economic, and social factors alongside military operations. Success couldn't be measured simply by ship-to-ship combat effectiveness or territorial control. However, Professor Kethvar said slowly, such a simulation would require extensive preparation and specialized parameters. Political factors, economic considerations, and civilian population dynamics would all need to be modeled accurately. Marcus nodded, understanding the implications. This wouldn't be a one-hour tactical exercise in the simulation chamber. It would be a comprehensive strategic campaign requiring days or weeks to complete properly. I propose a modified format, Professor Kethvar continued. A week-long intensive simulation with both students commanding opposing forces through the first 3 years of the conflict. Political and economic factors will be modeled by Academy staff to ensure realism. Veltra's expression showed satisfaction. Acceptable. I will command rebel forces, Student Chun will represent Alliance authority. We will see whether human tactical innovation extends beyond simple military engagements. As the seminar concluded and students began filing out of the classroom, Marcus remained in his seat, contemplating what he had committed himself to. His previous simulation victories had established his credibility in military tactics, but this challenge would test his understanding of strategy in its broadest sense. Sarah Kim approached his seat, her expression concerned. Marcus, are you sure about this? The Zethkari rebellion was incredibly complex. Even experienced Alliance officers struggled with that conflict. I know, Marcus replied. But somebody needs to demonstrate that human strategic thinking can contribute to galactic security challenges. This might be the opportunity to prove that our military experience has value beyond simple tactical innovation. David Park joined the conversation, his xenosociology background making him particularly aware of the political implications. But if you fail, it could reinforce negative stereotypes about human strategic capabilities. You're not just representing yourself anymore. Marcus understood the pressure they were describing. His tactical simulation victories had elevated expectations about human military potential. Failure in a complex strategic scenario could undo that progress, and more. That's exactly why I have to try, Marcus said finally. If we only accept challenges we're certain to win, we'll never prove that we belong at this level. Professor Kethvar approached their small group, his ancient features showing what might have been approval. Student Chun, you have 7 days to prepare for the most complex strategic simulation the Academy has ever attempted. I suggest you use that time wisely. As Marcus gathered his materials and prepared to leave the seminar room, he realized that everything had changed once again. His classroom discussion had evolved into a formal challenge that would test not just his tactical skills, but his understanding of the broader relationship between military force and political authority. The Zethkari rebellion simulation would be his greatest test yet. Success could establish humans as valuable strategic partners within the alliance. Failure could marginalize Earth's influence for generations. The stakes had never been higher. The Academy's Strategic Operations Center buzzed with unprecedented activity as technicians prepared for the most ambitious simulation in its history. Unlike the single-chamber exercises Marcus had previously experienced, the Zethkari rebellion scenario required multiple interconnected systems modeling political, economic, and military factors across hundreds of star systems. Marcus stood before a wall-sized holographic display showing the initial rebellion territory, his mind still processing the magnitude of what he had undertaken. 7 days of intensive preparation had taught him more about asymmetric warfare theory than his previous academic year combined. But theoretical knowledge was about to meet practical reality. The observation galleries were packed beyond capacity. Word of the ambitious simulation had drawn faculty and students from across the Academy, along with representatives from several Alliance military commands. Marcus could see Admiral Kethran of the Fleet Strategic Council in the front row, her presence indicating that this exercise had attracted attention from the highest levels of Alliance leadership. Veltra occupied her command station with obvious confidence, surrounded by displays showing rebel force compositions, resource limitations, and political objectives. She had spent her preparation week studying historical rebel tactics and had clearly developed a sophisticated strategy for the campaign ahead. Professor Kethvar moved between the command stations, his ancient eyes bright with intellectual excitement. Students, you are about to engage in the most complex strategic simulation ever attempted at this academy. Your decisions will cascade through military, political, and economic systems in ways that mirror the actual challenges faced during the historical rebellion. Marcus activated his command interface, feeling the familiar sensation of expanded awareness as his consciousness linked with the simulation network. But this time the experience was vastly more complex. Instead of simple ship positions and tactical data, he could perceive economic indicators, political sentiment measurements, and social stability metrics across dozens of star systems. The rebellion territory consisted of 47 systems with a combined population of nearly 12 billion sentients. Industrial capacity was substantial, but not sufficient for extended military resistance against Alliance forces. Political unity among rebel systems was strong initially, but potentially fragile under pressure. Marcus commanded the 7th Fleet along with associated ground forces and civil administration units, roughly the same assets that had been historically assigned to suppress the rebellion. His mandate was straightforward: restore Alliance authority while minimizing casualties and preserving political legitimacy. Simulation began, Professor Kethvar announced. The first phase unfolded over the equivalent of 6 months of accelerated time. Veltra immediately demonstrated her understanding of irregular warfare principles by avoiding direct military confrontation while launching attacks against Alliance supply lines and isolated installations. Marcus watched his casualty reports with growing concern. Following traditional Alliance doctrine, he had attempted to establish secure zones around major population centers while hunting down rebel military forces. But Veltra's rebels operated in small, mobile units that struck quickly and then disappeared into civilian populations. After 3 simulated months, Marcus had lost 47 ships and nearly 3,000 personnel while achieving virtually no strategic progress. Rebel attacks were increasing in frequency and sophistication, while political support for Alliance authority was declining in contested systems. In the observation galleries, Marcus could hear murmurs of concern from the human delegation. His conventional approach was clearly failing, just as traditional tactics had failed in the historical rebellion. But Marcus had learned from his previous simulations. Instead of continuing with ineffective strategies, he began implementing the counterinsurgency principles he had discussed during the seminar. All fleet commanders, Transition to population security protocols, Marcus transmitted. Primary objective is civilian protection, not rebel elimination. The tactical shift was dramatic. Instead of concentrating forces for large-scale sweep operations, Marcus distributed his assets to provide continuous security for civilian populations. Fleet units were assigned to specific systems with orders to prevent rebel operations rather than pursue rebel forces. The change in approach initially appeared counterproductive. Rebel attacks continued, and Marcus's forces seemed passive and reactive. But Marcus was playing a longer strategic game, one that the observation galleries couldn't yet understand. The turning point came during the simulation's second year. Veltra's rebel forces, unable to operate freely in systems protected by Alliance security, were forced to become increasingly aggressive to maintain operational tempo. This brought them into direct conflict with civilian populations who were experiencing improved security and economic conditions under Alliance protection. All civil administration units implement economic development protocols, Marcus ordered. Focus on infrastructure improvement and job creation in contested systems. Marcus had realized that military force alone couldn't resolve the rebellion. The underlying grievances that had sparked the conflict, economic inequality, and political representation, had to be addressed alongside security concerns. The strategy required enormous resources and patience, but the results became evident by the simulation's third year. Systems under Alliance protection were experiencing unprecedented prosperity, while rebel-controlled territories struggled with economic disruption and security challenges. Veltra adapted brilliantly to Marcus's evolving strategy, shifting from purely military operations to political warfare designed to undermine Alliance legitimacy. She initiated propaganda campaigns, targeted Alliance civil administrators for assassination, and attempted to provoke Alliance forces into heavy-handed responses that would alienate civilian populations. Admiral Chan, came a transmission from his civil administration chief. Rebel propaganda is claiming that our economic development programs are attempts to buy loyalty rather than genuine reform. Marcus considered the challenge carefully. Veltra was forcing him to confront the fundamental question of whether improved conditions constituted genuine political reform or merely more sophisticated control. Implement political autonomy protocols, Marcus replied after a long pause. Begin transferring civil authority to locally elected governments in secured systems. Alliance forces maintain security responsibilities only. The decision was radical by Alliance standards. Marcus was essentially granting limited independence to systems that had recently been in rebellion, trusting that voluntary cooperation would prove more stable than imposed authority. In the observation galleries, the decision created a stir of discussion. Admiral Kethran leaned forward with obvious interest, while several faculty members began taking detailed notes. The political autonomy strategy proved devastatingly effective. Systems that had been wavering in their support for the rebellion suddenly found themselves with more self-governance than they had possessed before the conflict began. Rebel recruiting became extremely difficult when potential supporters were offered legitimate political participation instead. Veltra made one final desperate attempt to salvage her position by launching coordinated attacks against Alliance fleet units, hoping to provoke the kind of military response that would vindicate rebel claims about Alliance oppression. But Marcus had anticipated this strategy. His forces absorbed the attacks without retaliation, instead increasing security around civilian populations while publicizing rebel willingness to endanger noncombatants. All fleet commanders maintain defensive protocols, Marcus transmitted. Our mission is population protection, not rebel destruction. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Alliance forces focused on civilian security while rebel forces launched increasingly desperate attacks that mainly harmed innocent populations. Political support for the rebellion collapsed within months. The simulation ended during its fourth year with Veltra's surrender. The rebellion had been suppressed not through military victory, but through political transformation that addressed underlying grievances while maintaining Alliance authority. As the holographic displays faded and the simulation chamber returned to normal lighting, the observation galleries remained silent for long moments. The strategic complexity of what they had witnessed required time to process fully. Professor Kethvar approached Marcus's command station, his ancient features showing unmistakable approval. Student Chun, explain your strategic reasoning for the observers. Marcus took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. The key insight was recognizing that the rebellion wasn't primarily a military problem. The underlying issues were political and economic. Military force could provide security, but only political solutions could achieve lasting stability. Admiral Kethran descended from the observation gallery, her presence commanding immediate attention throughout the chamber. As one of the Alliance's most senior fleet commanders, her opinion would carry enormous weight. Student Chun, she said formally, your approach to counterinsurgency warfare differs significantly from established Alliance doctrine. What makes you confident that such strategies would prove effective in actual combat situations? Marcus felt the weight of the question. He was being asked to defend not just his simulation performance, but the broader principles underlying human strategic thinking. Admiral, I believe the principles scale because they're based on understanding the relationship between military force and political authority. Human history demonstrates that military victory without political legitimacy is temporary at best. Elaborate. Marcus activated his tactical display, showing key decision points from the simulation. Traditional military doctrine assumes that defeating enemy forces will achieve strategic objectives. But in asymmetric conflicts, the enemy's military capability isn't the center of gravity, their political support is. Admiral Kethran studied the tactical progression with obvious interest. You suggest that political factors should drive military strategy rather than the reverse. I suggest they should be integrated from the beginning, Marcus replied. Military operations that undermine political objectives are ultimately self-defeating, regardless of their tactical success. Veltra, who had remained silent during the initial discussion, finally activated her communication link. Student Chin's strategy was effective, but it required resources and patience that might not be available in actual military situations. That's a fair criticism, Marcus acknowledged. But the alternative is often prolonged conflict that consumes even more resources while achieving less stable outcomes. Admiral Kethran manipulated Marcus's tactical displays, examining specific decisions and their cascading effects. Student Chun, your simulation performance suggests that human strategic thinking offers valuable perspectives for Alliance military doctrine. Would you be willing to present your analysis to the Fleet Strategic Council? Marcus felt his world shift. Being invited to address the Fleet Strategic Council was an honor typically reserved for senior officers and distinguished faculty. For a first-year academy student, it was almost unprecedented. I would be honored, Admiral. Professor Kethvar stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored colleagues, today we have witnessed something remarkable. Student Chun has demonstrated that strategic innovation can emerge from unexpected sources and that military doctrine benefits from diverse perspectives. The professor paused, looking around the packed observation galleries. More importantly, this exercise has shown that the principles underlying effective strategy transcend specific cultural or technological contexts. Human military experience, though limited in galactic terms, offers insights that can enhance Alliance security capabilities. Thekmore rose from his position in the Corvin section, his scarred features showing genuine respect. I formally request permission to attend Student Chin's presentation to the Fleet Strategic Council. His strategic innovations deserve broader study within Alliance military academies. A murmur of agreement rippled through the observation galleries. Students and faculty from dozens of species were acknowledging that human strategic thinking had proven its value through rigorous testing. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus remained at his command station, still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. He had entered the academy as a representative of Earth's provisional Alliance membership, viewed with skepticism and barely concealed condescension. He was leaving as someone whose strategic innovations would be studied by the Alliance's highest military authorities. The conversation about human capabilities had shifted from whether Earth belonged in the galactic community to what unique contributions humans could make to collective security. Sarah Kim approached his station, her face glowing with pride and excitement. Marcus, do you understand what you've accomplished? You've proven that human strategic thinking can contribute to galactic military doctrine. David Park joined them, his xenosociology background helping him grasp the broader implications. This goes beyond military strategy. You've demonstrated that newer alliance members can offer valuable perspectives to established institutions. That's going to change how the entire galactic community thinks about development and integration. Marcus Luke,